welcome to Simpler Bible, a daily journey to biblical understanding. Today has us still in Daniel, and we're going to look at another story that is wildly popular, and it is one that we all probably heard. If you grew up in church, if you were a kid in church, this is definitely a story you heard. And so we're going to go through Daniel 5 and 6 today. Pick up with me in Daniel chapter 4. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all his people, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and the wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures through all generations. Now, these are things that are true about God. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion endures through all generations. These are things that are true about God. It's interesting that Nebuchadnezzar is the one saying them, because Nebuchadnezzar, as you'll see here and then later in a couple of minor prophets in a few days, Nebuchadnezzar is incredibly arrogant. He kind of believes himself to be almost equal with God in some of his own estimations. But it is true that God has a kingdom which will never fail, never come to an end. We see some of that in Isaiah 6, maybe 9 through 11, something like that. It's speaking about Christ there in Isaiah 9, talking about his kingdom being an everlasting kingdom. But these are true things that Nebuchadnezzar is saying about God. I'm just not sure he's completely convinced of it. So he says this. So he's recounting, I guess this is a little retrospective. So he's saying, look, let me tell you the wonderful things that God did. Let me tell you about these things. And then the rest of the chapter, except for the last few verses, is going to kind of be a flashback. So if we were watching a movie, this would now have to be in black and white or sepia tones, or if it was a cheesy movie, kind of a goofy movie, there'd be the wiggly lines and everything would go back, right? And so Nebuchadnezzar is going to talk about being at ease in his palace. This is a long chapter. I'm going to just skip around a little bit, but it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house, prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they would make known to me the interpretation of the dream. I do find it funny that he's asking for all the wise men, since years earlier, and it's been years since Daniel interpreted the first dream. Years earlier, Daniel interpreted a dream for him. I don't know why he doesn't just reach out to Daniel. The magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me its interpretation. At last, Daniel came in before me, he who's named Belteshazzar after my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that it is no mystery is too difficult for you. Tell me the vision of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. The vision of my head as I lay in my bed were these. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew great and became strong, and its top reached to the heavens, and it was visible to the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heaven lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven, and he proclaimed loudly and said, Chop down the tree, chop off its branches, strip off its leaves, scatter its fruit, let the beasts flee from under it, and let the birds flee from its branches, but leave the stump of its root in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beast and the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's mind. Let his beast mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time, or 7 years, pass over for him. This sentence is by the decree of the watchers, and the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living one may know that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets over the lowliest of men. So a couple of things. This is the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and Daniel goes to interpret the dream. There's a couple of things I want to point out before the interpretation, though. This phrase right here, that it says in verse 17, that God, Most High, rules over the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he sees fit, and appoints over it the lowliest of men. This is something that's really interesting, because it's going to be repeated a couple of times here in the book of Daniel, a couple of times in our reading today, in fact, and twice, I think, in this chapter alone, that God is over the earth and he puts over it whoever he sees fit. And it kind of makes me think of like Romans 13, where Paul is reminding the people in Rome to pray for their leaders, and he says that no one has come to that position unless God has appointed them there. Like these are These are the people that God has put in place. And even guys like Herod and the people who were in charge in the days of Jesus' crucifixion, you're like, these guys were put in place for this purpose. Nebuchadnezzar was put in place for the purpose of God bringing discipline on his people, Israel. And so it's really interesting to kind of think about that God has a purpose in this, right? So Daniel tells him the interpretation. He says, King, it's you. You've become powerful. You've become lifted up to heaven. All the nations of the earth look to you. And he goes, but because you've become arrogant, what's going to happen is you're going to be basically chopped down, and your mind is going to turn into the mind of an animal, and you're going to wander among the fields like this wild man for 7 years. And it says this, verse 32, you shall be driven among men, your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox for 7 periods of time will pass over you until you know that the Most High God rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to whomever he wishes. Nebuchadnezzar was kind of like looking at all of his stuff, and he's like, look at how powerful I am. Look at how great I am. Look at what I've done. And God's going, no. I've given you this. I've allowed you to have this. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men, and he ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven until his hair grew long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. And so what happened is that Daniel, I skipped a part I shouldn't have, but Daniel tells him the interpretation of the dream, and 12 months later, verses 29 and 30, Nebuchadnezzar's up on the roof of his house and he's looking over everything. He's like, oh yeah, I'm a great king. Look how fantastic all this stuff is that I've built and that I've done, and look what I've accomplished. And that's when he becomes like a beast of an animal. However, at the end of the 7 years, his reasoning returns to him, verse 34, and I blessed the Most High God, and I praised and I honored him. This is Nebuchadnezzar. For his dominion is everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures to all generations. And so he recognizes the power and the glory of God. So the end of the chapter is where the beginning of the chapter, the first part of the chapter starts. So the beginning and the end are the same time period, because he's like, look, let me tell you the amazing power of God. That's the beginning. And then he says, here's what happened. I had a dream. Daniel interpreted the dream. 12 months later, I went crazy. 7 years after that, my sins returned to me, and then I gave glory to God. So the first few verses and the last few verses of chapter 4 are the same time period. Daniel 5, this is after 70 years of captivity. This is 70 years of captivity. Daniel has been in Babylon for 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar is long since dead. His great-grandson, Belshazzar, maybe great-great-grandson, I forget exactly how many greats. King Belshazzar has become king. And listen to this. It says, King Belshazzar made a feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of the gold and silver of Nebuchadnezzar, his father, and it says father here, but it's used kind of like ancestor, right? Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem to be brought out, that the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines could drink from them. And they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple of the Lord, out of the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and the lords, his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold and the gods of silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. Immediately, fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote in plaster on the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. The king saw it as it wrote, and the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his limbs gave ways, and his knees knocked together. And he called out loudly and said, who can interpret this for me? Who can tell me? Because there was writing, this hand appeared, and it wrote on the wall in this place where they're eating, and the language was not known to any of the people in the room. And so it wrote this foreign language. He's like, we got to find somebody who can interpret this. I'll make them the third ruler in all of Babylon. They'll be the third most powerful person in the land. And they can't figure it out. And finally, the queen mother, she comes and she says, look, in the days of your ancestor, in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, there was a wise man, Daniel, who could interpret dreams. Let's ask him. So they bring Daniel in, and Daniel comes in to interpret the dreams. This is verse 13. Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are the Daniel, the one of the exiles, whom the king my father brought from Judah. Now, keep in mind, Daniel was not 6 when he got carried away to Babylon. Because remember, a year in, he's already ruling in Babylon. We saw that yesterday. And so Daniel, maybe 19, 20, 25 years old when he came in. This is now 70 years later. So he's in his 80s to 90s for sure. And so here he is, and he says, I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and to make known to me its interpretation, but they couldn't show the interpretation of the matter. I have heard that you can give an interpretation and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you will be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and you'll be the third ruler of the kingdom. Now Daniel's going to answer here the same way, or a similar way, that he answered Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 2. Daniel answered and said to the king, let your gifts be for you and yourself. Give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to you, king, and make known to him the interpretation. And so here's the thing. He tells him again about Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, remember how Nebuchadnezzar got proud and God brought him low. And he says, but now you've lifted yourself up against God, and God's about to bring you low. And he says, this is what the hand came to write. And he says, this is the writing, verse 25. Mene, mene, tekel, uparson, or parson. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene means God has numbered your days. Mene means numbered. God has numbered your days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the scales and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command that Daniel was clothed in purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made to him that he would be the third ruler. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So this is the end of the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. And the Persians have come to power now, and the Persians have destroyed the Babylonians. And a couple of things, let me just leave you with this one thing. If you've ever heard somebody say, I can see the hand writing on the wall, they're talking about their job, they're talking about their marriage, they're talking about a company going bankrupt or whatever. I could see the hand writing on the wall. What people mean by that is this. They don't even know, most of the time, they don't even know they're ripping off Daniel 5. But what people mean by that is this thing is coming to an end. So when they say, my marriage was so bad I could see the hand writing on the wall, what they mean is my marriage came to an end. Man, things at work had gotten so tense I could see the handwriting on the wall. What they mean is I knew my job was coming to an end. And they rip it off from Daniel chapter 5, but they don't even know it. And it's really funny to me how many things in the Bible we use in our culture kind of just in a colloquial, I can't even say the word, and I don't know if I'm using it right. It just popped into my head. We use it in a cultural way, and most people don't even know it's from the Bible. So next time you hear somebody say, the hand's writing on the wall, you can be like, Daniel 5, I see that you know your Bible. And then they don't know their Bible, but you have a chance to talk to them about it. I don't know. Be weird about it. I'm weird about everything, and so I invite you to occasionally be weird. Now, Daniel 6. Darius is ruling over the kingdom of Babylon for the king in Persia. Darius is kind of the guy, the governor, the king who's been assigned to Babylon. And it says this, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom satraps to be through the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So King Darius comes in and he sets over Babylon 3 rulers, of which Daniel is one. And he says, look, I need you to take care of everything in the land. So this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and the satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. Well, we know what that excellent spirit was. It was the Spirit of God. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now, the other 2 presidents and all the other satraps, the Bible tells us there was about 120 satraps, they don't like that Daniel is in charge. So imagine the Persian armies come in, they've defeated your king, they've defeated Belshazzar, they've killed him, and now what they're doing is they're putting people in charge to kind of manage the country for the king, for the attacking king. We need some people who will manage it. And the guy that they put in charge basically over everybody is Daniel. He's not even a Babylonian. He was a slave who was brought here 70 years ago. So this really ticks off the other 2 presidents and all the other satraps because they're like, look, this dude's a foreigner. We want him out of the way. So they devise a plan. And they want Daniel to be put to death, but they say this in verse 5, we won't find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection to the law of his God. So they knew that Daniel was such a man of integrity, they weren't going to be able to do anything about it unless they could find a way to convict him about his God. And so they go to the king and they say that the Persians and the Medes have a rule that if you make any law, if the king seals any law into order, not even the king himself can break it. So they go to the king and they say, look, king, they play up to his ego. You're such a great king. Make a law that if anybody prays to anyone but you for the next 30 days, they're thrown to the lions. And so he says, I love that. That sounds great. Signed into law. And they go and they watch Daniel. And Daniel, having heard that this was the case, 3 times a day continues to pray to the Lord. And so what they do is they go tell the king, didn't you say that anybody who prays to anybody but you is going to be thrown into the king, into the lions? And he says, yeah. And they say, well, your buddy Daniel, he's been praying to the Lord, not to you. So the king is grieved over this. He goes and he gets Daniel, though he can't break the law. He goes and gets Daniel and he throws Daniel into the lion's den. And the king says to him in verse 16, may your God whom you serve continually deliver you. And they take a stone, they put it over the mouth of the den. King goes home, can't sleep all night. The next morning, hurries with haste to the lion's den. And then when he comes near the lion's den, he calls into it. He has the stone removed. Daniel, has the God you serve, the living God, been able to deliver you from the lions? And Daniel says, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found innocent before him, and also against you I've done no wrong. So the king is exceedingly glad and pulls Daniel out of the pit. And then he says, bring those men, those wicked men who conspired against Daniel, bring their wives and their children and throw them into the pit. Now remember, there's 120 of these guys. The Bible does not tell us how many they threw into the pit, but all the men who conspired against Daniel and all their wives and all their kids are thrown into the pit. And the Bible says this, before they even reached the bottom of the pit, the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all of their bones in pieces. So they don't touch Daniel all night, but let's pretend there's just 3 guys and each guy has 1 wife and each guy has just 1 kid. That's 9 bodies, but there's probably more than that. And the lions ripped them to pieces. And the king says to all the peoples and all the nations, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree in my royal dominion. People are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God enduring forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He delivers and he rescues by signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And so, great story. I love it so much. This is at the end of the 70 years of Babylonian captivity, and God is about to restore all things back to Jerusalem. And I have taken enough of your time today. Join me tomorrow for the conclusion of Daniel, and we'll see you there. Thank you so much for journeying with us today at Simpler Bible through another section of Scripture where we come to know and understand God a little bit better. Look, if you're brand new to Simpler Bible, we have all sorts of resources available for you. Go to our website, simplerbible.com, and there you can find these videos, you can find our podcast, you can find links to our social media, and you can even find a blog post with additional scriptures if you want to go into a little bit more study than we had time to cover in this podcast and video today. We hope that this tool will be exactly that for you, a tool. Not something that replaces your daily walk with God, but something that enhances your daily walk with God and helps you to know and enjoy Him more. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll see you again tomorrow.